Mesdames, Messieurs, chers collègues, my inspiration comes from Professor Carneiro da Cunha's work, Culture and Culture. But I must lay some ground before making that evident. Let me say how welcome it is to have the opportunity to reflect back on La Pensée Sauvage and its disquisition on relationships. This occasion is another kind of looking back too. Several years ago, Manuela, Philippe, and I took part in a debate in 1996 at the 1996 meetings of the European Association of Social Anthropologists. The debate was on intellectual property and approaches to indigenous knowledge. It's wonderful to be together again, even if the agenda has shifted in the interim. For me, that was a beginning of an interest in cultural property and led to a collaborative research project in Papua New Guinea with United Kingdom and Papua New Guinean colleagues. James Leach, who is also here, joined the project, and although his subsequent research on knowledge practices was to take in natural scientists and choreographers, fieldwork in Melanesia continues to inform his work, and in particular, he has developed a fruitful approach to relations, which I'm tempted to borrow from. However, I return to issues in indigenous knowledge, if the last speaker will forgive me, in which my own engagement has been sadly discontinuous, and I return to it from a rather different vantage point. What jumps out from a rereading of La Pensée Sauvage is Lévi-Strauss's creative play with terms and relations, and I think this might have some interest for the themes of this symposium. In the spirit of sharing certain commonalities of ethnographic experience among colleagues from Amazonia and Melanesia, we might remark those moments when it seems that what Euro-Americans would understand as properties of the natural world have to be made and remade through human action. Qualities, attributes, capacities, the properties by which things appear, do not necessarily announce themselves. As objects of knowledge, the entities or beings in question may appear with uncertain or unstable properties, as Anne-Christine Taylor wrote in 1996 of the state of Achua selfhood. And there may even be degrees of instability, as Laura Rival has observed. If in some instances Euro-Americans would concur, how do we know that this plant will grow? In others, how to tell whether a being is human or not, they would no doubt demur. And while they would allow that uncertainty can precipitate action, phenomena presented in Amazonia and Melanesia raise a prior question about what an object of knowledge might be in these circumstances. Much of this will be familiar to some of you. Like the Amazonian Piro who inspect babies to make certain they're not fishes or tortoises, the Melanesian Korowai are equally doubtful about a newborn, a being without kin. If human babies have to be rendered human before they're allowed to survive, in both places kinship has to be established with one's relatives. Moreover, these attributes are not made once and for all. They acquire remaking. The physical body is under constant fabrication. Gender must be differentiated. Boys, males, rendered male. One could epitomize it in the need to demonstrate that something is edible by eating it. The point is, intervention is required. Thus, where their growth is so important, as in much of Melanesia, plants and animals cannot be left to grow by themselves, as Philippe also makes very clear for the Achua. For those Euro-Americans who take the basis of natural science being doubt about the nature of the world, and the basis of a techno-industrial economy being the interventionist ability to act on knowledge, some of this, for example, testing the edibility of things, might look obvious. At the same time, from this vantage point of naturalism, and I'm borrowing Philippe's term, of course, the natural properties being probed here are bizarre. Euro-Americans know that a child born of human parents is human. Or when edibility has nothing to do with the intrinsic characteristics of the food and everything to do with the social capacities of the eater, the effective properties seem to be lodged in the wrong place. Or else the objects of knowledge being fabricated can simply seem superfluous. You might want to grow boys into men, but the one attribute they already share with adults is surely their gender. By contrast, the remaking of the world on the part of the Euro-American knowledge industry is premised on a progressive aspiration to provide ever clearer accounts than before of what we already know about the properties of phenomena. The attributes of things may be tested, but when properties appear unstable, that's taken as a sign of what lies not at the heart of knowledge, but rather at its cutting edge, at its outer limits. But let me look into this kind of remaking from this second naturalist vantage point for a moment. One significant mechanism lies in the capacity to draw relations. Knowledge progresses when new connections between entities are made, correlations proved, hitherto unforeseen links made evident. Scientists, scholars, engineers search for new relations. And I'm going to give an example in a moment, an example also of when it looked as though the world was going to be remade. The field of endeavor, called synthetic biology, seeks new combinations of materials in which either the combinations or the materials or both may be foreign to the natural world. To ensure continuing support, its practitioners also have to seek relations with those outside this field. One interdisciplinary venture attempted just this. A network of synthetic biologists at the University of California, Berkeley, were joined in 2006-07 by a small team of sociocultural anthropologists under Paul Rabinow. The anthropologists were to consider cultural and ethical issues. The promise for them was to be able to experiment with ethical forms, just as the biologists were experimenting with life forms. Potentially, the two parties had great interest in each other's knowledge. As the anthropologist said, our goal is to design new practices that bring the biosciences and the human sciences into a mutually collaborative relationship. It invites us to think, and thinking involves the work of contributing to the form of the near future scientifically and ethically. However, it seemed that the biologists assumed that they would be dealing with ethics in modes to which they were already accustomed. There were repeated requests for the anthropologists to provide expert opinion or behave as public relations personnel. And of course, at times, anthropologists have been only too ready to respond. But struggling to articulate a novel place for an ethics beyond the accepted conventions, these refused. Indeed, looking for reciprocity in terms of willingness to remold problems, they encountered little enthusiasm for experiment in this vein, and the biologists found the anthropologists' intervention in turn threatening, incomprehensible, or trivial. Now, I've chosen this example away from the arena of development and indigenous knowledge to highlight some of the consequences of relations for Euro-American knowledge practices. There was the evident role that social relationships played, new knowledge generated in the context of new institutional links. Equally evident was the enthusiasm for making new conceptual relations. Conceptual tools had to be in place, of course, a primary one for Rabinow being the concept of assemblages. And I quote, "While an entity's properties are given and may be denumerable as a closed list, its capacities are not given, since there's no way to tell in advance in what way a given entity may affect or be affected by innumerable other entities. Synthetic biology is an example of new assemblages of organic things being brought into the world. And assemblages are all about relations. And I will quote again from Paul Rabinow. Assemblages are composed of pre-existing things that, when brought into relations with other pre-existing things, open up different capacities not inherent in the original things, but only come into existence in the relations established in the assemblage. Thus, an assemblage brings together entities in the world into a proximity in which they establish relations among and between themselves while remaining external to each other and thereby retain their original properties. In short, relations can open up the capacities of entities in unexpected ways. There may be no ontological continuity. Capacities can come into existence through new relations. But is the instability described here like the instability that creates routine agnosticism or even anxiety in Amazonia and Melanesia? Suppose it's not just the capacities of given properties that shift through different relationships, but the properties as such. This would surely be, from a naturalist perspective, world-making too. Yet our Amazonian colleagues, who might well demur in any case over the verb to make, would probably reject the apocalyptic connotation that the phrase has. For their Amazonian subjects, it would seem it is totally and radically the case that perceptions have to be revised all the time. Material from Melanesia, on the other hand, suggests both a similar tendency to revisions and the possibility of staging them in something approaching the experimenter's mode. But before I turn in more detail to Melanesia, a small observation about the description of relations in La Pensée Sauvage makes me think that perhaps we can keep these three ethnographic locations in play. The observation concerns the language of description. I'm not qualifying Lévi-Strauss's interpretations, merely making a comment that he probably wouldn't have thought worth remarking on unless he were concerned with the translation from French into English. My audacity here is that this observation does not, alas, reflect a more generous acquaintance with the French language. But as the challenge is to the English speaker, I hope I shall be forgiven. In what follows, I take the properties of entities as potentially analogous to the terms of a relationship. One consequence of the theoretical thrust that privileges not terms but relations between terms is that in describing worlds such as those of Amazonia or Melanesia, the anthropologist need not take the properties that people ascribe to entities seriously, that is, the terms, precisely because of the creativity of the relations. And I quote one commentator, narratives that seem absurd when discussed for their meaning become coherent when discussed for the operations that they perform. Thus, manipulating relations of similarity or difference demonstrates an intellectual capacity that is the mythic or concrete counterpart to systematic thinking. Indeed, detecting the relations between entities, between terms, becomes a sign in La Pensée Sauvage of systematic thinking, of which classificatory schema are a prime exemplar. And I would ask you to allow me to revisit his careful probing of the famous naming system of the Penan of Borneo. And here I'm going to ask you, please, to suspend comprehension for a moment. You don't need to follow what I'm going to say in order to get the argument, but I can only make the argument through a concrete case. That means introducing notions relevant to the case, but not to the argument. But rather than explaining them, it's probably simpler for you just to ignore them. Allow me to revisit, then, the naming system of the Penan. Are we dealing with classes of individual positions or with classes of relations? And why do personal names vanish when they're conjoined with the recall of the birth or death of close relatives? For how one is known changes all the time. Someone known as mother of so-and-so becomes mother of another so-and-so when the next child is born. And I quote from Lévi-Strauss, a dead person loses his name for the same reason that a living person loses his. When a living Penan assumes a necronym, such as father dead, he becomes one of the terms in a relationship of which the other, since he is dead, no longer exists save in that relation which defines a living person with reference to him. And this is the beginning of my observation. What I'm going to read out now is a passage in English in which I shall supply one or two French terms, and you must forgive my accent. It is, of course, from Lévi-Strauss. The system, this is the Penan naming system, the system as a whole is definable by three types of periodicity. In relation to vis-à-vis, his ascendants, an individual passes from necronym to necronym. In relation to vis-à-vis, his siblings, he passes from autonym, that is proper name, to necronym. And in relation to vis-à-vis, his children, he passes from technonym to necronym. But what is the logical relation, le rapport, between these three types of terms? Technonyms and necronyms refer to a kinship tie, lien de parenté, and are therefore relational, relationnel terms. Autonyms can be opposed to them from this point of view. An autonym only determines a self by contrast to other selves. This opposition allows in return a distinction between the technonym and the necronym. The former contains a proper name, which can be defined as expressing a relation to an other self, une relation à un soi autre. The necronym consists in the statement of a kinship relation, une relation de parenté, which is that of an unnamed other with a self, that is, an other relation, une relation autre. The contrasts and symmetries explored here are relations opened up by Lévi-Strauss in order to demonstrate the classificatory logic underlying Penan usage. He went on to ask about the relation, un rapport, between the technonym and the other two types, autonym and necronym, invoking the contrast between a relation to an other self, technonym, and an other relation, necronym. Here, the terms, in the logical sense of a term to a relation, shift. In the first case, the terms are selves. In the second case, the terms are relations. Now, the English speaker might ask what the concept of relation is doing here when it's not variegated by the subtle differentiations implied by the French. There are at least three modalities. First, one class of relations derives from the narration of the author, as when he asks what the analytical relations between certain terms are. Second, another consists in what he calls relational terms, which derive from vernacular usage that point to relations between persons based on kinship. Third is where what the author designates as a relation comes from uncovering a logical characteristic in phenomena not previously apparent, but then is adopted into analysis, as when he talks of the technonym expressing a relation to an other self, the necronym a relation to an other relation. Over the course of this passage, the French differentiates between these various usages. In English, they are run together. Let me move to a further stage of my observations. One of the charms of Manuela's story of the category of culture lies just in how she shows the way we slide in and out of usages that are doing quite different jobs of work, lightly inflecting the difference between culture and culture. She describes how culture travels the world, often to political effect in people's delineation of themselves. At the same time, culture coexists with culture that runs according to its own internal logic. The point is the coexistence of these categories between which public discourse, indigenous or metropolitan, weaves in and out. And I wonder whether English speakers, at least, might in the same way want to discriminate between different kinds of relations. The argument about Penan naming yielded three inflections of the concept of relation in anthropological description, and there'll be numerous others at different orders of data and exposition. But just as there is a virtue in sweeping up diverse designations of culture into a contrast between culture and culture, I want for a moment to consider an equally reductive distinction between relation and relation. But because this particular word, relation, is integral to any English-speaking narrative, I need to denote those moments where it's the object of narrational reflection, an object of knowledge, and my notation has to be one that you can hear and that I can speak. So I'm going to propose the rather clumsy distinction between the marked relation as relation 1 and the unmarked relation as relation 2. The crucial point is the criterion that relates relation 1, that relates them. Manuela's distinction lies in the principle of intelligibility on which her two categorizations of culture rest. This is not just a matter of the degree of self-awareness or self-consciousness, rather by contrast with the internal logic of culture that permits all kinds of divisions within, the interethnic logic of culture assumes in its adages about sharing, I quote, a collective regime imposed on what was previously a network of differential rights. The criterion that I want to suggest for relations 1 and relations 2 lies in two practices of use on the anthropologist's part. Relation 1 is evident in descriptions of overt attempts to refine the specification of independently existing terms by creating relations between terms, and Rabinow's description of the assemblage is a good example, where you will also recall that capacities may be at issue, but properties are not. Equally, however, the way I'm fabricating it, relation 1 may be found where, for the purposes of analysis, relations are privileged over terms, which is also the locus for relation 2. When relations are privileged, we might say that they pre-exist the terms. But the terms are brought into existence in two contrasting modes, with implications for how anthropologists might describe the properties attached to phenomena, and it's on these that I want to focus. The other thing I'm now going to say rests on the context where relations are privileged over terms. Briefly, relations 1 brings into new positions of stability the properties of the terms they precipitate, demarcating old or new categories of existence, indeterminacy resting on the power of the relations to do so. However, relations 2, we could say, are indeterminate as to the existential state of the terms, indeed may precipitate indeterminacy. People don't necessarily know where a relation will lead them. More prosaically, the terms, the properties of phenomena, are evident less as categories of existence than as functions or effects of a relational facility. So let me come to the final stage of my observation. These two kinds of relations coexist in anthropological accounts. In the extract from La Pensée Sauvage, the analytical relation is an example of relation 1, the uncovering of the terms of the third case, an example of relations 2. In fact, apropos the latter, relations 2, Lévi-Strauss actually italicizes his discovery of the terms. The two terms, relation to an other self and an other relation, that he brings into relation with each other, were not in his analysis before. This is unpredictability on the edge of knowledge, and the reader wonders what else might emerge. Are they, one hesitates, dependent on that specific line of reasoning? Of course, once identified in an academic context, relations 2 may become the subject of relations 1 scrutiny. And what about the relational designations of kinship? It is particularly when anthropologists try to describe forms of indigenous knowledge that relations 1 and 2 may also appear as coexisting in the phenomena under study. The point of the Penan description is that kinship classification is a matter of the categorical pre-existing delineation of relative standings in relation to one another, relations 1, but it only operates when, for example, it's used as a mode of address in a modified way that requires finding out people's specific personal circumstances, what being a particular kind of relative means that I would call relations 2. And you might be wondering what on earth the interest of all this is for the symposium. The interests of the issues of indigenous knowledge include the primordial one that La Pensée Sauvage lays out: how do we assess one another's knowledge? Relations 1 is anthropology's default mode intrinsic to the dominant orientation of Euro-American or naturalist knowledge-making, although by no means limited to it. But such knowledge-making recognizes other knowledge in relations one form more easily than when it takes the form of relations two. And systematic thinking encoded in classificatory systems is the archetype, that is a recognition of indigenous knowledge. The issue anthropology comes back to is that knowledge whose default mode rests on relations two may not look like knowledge at all. Interdisciplinarity encounters offer countless examples. The interchange between the Californian anthropologists and the biologists exposed a relations two, a problem of the currency of communication that it had not seemed necessary to specify. The poor biologists were looking for knowledge in the form of expertise. The poor anthropologists seemingly imagined a kind of direct encounter in which their knowledges would be joined together. At the same time, the anthropologists, devised a program for ethical practice that could have been a currency for interchange, yet only seemed obscure or aggressive to the biologists. While their approaches were evidently different, that there would be an issue of a communication as such, which I would categorize as a relations two problem, was not brought overtly into the idea of knowledge interchange, and the outcome was intellectual aspirations brought and the project put at stake. However, in the light of what I'm about to recount very briefly from Melanesia, think of the initial hope that the anthropologists had expressed. They were looking for a relationship, I quote, designed to facilitate currently existing relations between knowledge and care in terms of mutual flourishing. Our challenge was to produce knowledge in such a way that the work enhanced us ethically and ontologically. Such a project, they repeat, obliges us to think, and that would go for failure too. Yet more knowledge generated for the anthropologists, more relations to speak out. Now, remaking the world in Melanesia is not necessarily about bringing new in the sense of novel things into existence. Rather, existence itself depends on the world being constantly remade, new in the sense of a new day. Such remakings find a concentrated form in rituals that are staged when the desire to bring about renewed health and well-being must be acted upon. Only thus will abundance attend, as in the example to follow, gardening, hunting, childbearing, and so forth. Participants, hoping for success, are dogged by uncertainty and fear of failure. However, they may summon enactments of relations that do not seem to relate in relations one sense, that do not seem to relate to such ends at all. Consider the Middle Wagi Valley in the Papua New Guinea highlands. The time is the 1950s, the people the Kuma. Their ethnographer, Murray Ray, described a display of aggression that men of a clan would mount as part of the fertility-promoting pig ceremonial. Their dance with spears, a stylized brandishing of weapons against unseen enemies, directed aggression outside the particular clan whose prosperity was at stake. At the same time, such ceremonies were also occasions on which people attacked one another within the clan community. But these were more like games or sporting contests. The protagonists would be rival subclans or men versus women. A mock battle that Ray witnessed in 1955 began with men and women grouping at opposite ends of a ceremonial ground, stinging nettles in their hands, rushing forward to brush the skin of their opponents, then retreating to hurl ash and lumps of mud from a distance. And the game could become quite rough. The difference is evident. Aggression against enemy clans was mediated by the dancers' weapons, movements, and decorations. Clansmen presented their bodies with the signs of outward hostility and inward solidarity. The enemies, traditional enemies, were those in perpetually hostile relations to the clan, always to be attacked, and certainly not present on this occasion. The men and women, by contrast, were familiar to one another, and the nettles, ash, and mud created bodily intimacy. Body contact was, in effect, unmediated. Now, mediated and unmediated are not Ray's terms. She talks about two types of ritual conflict. Ray sums up the games by observing that the drama lies in the conflict itself, whereas the spear dance dramatizes readiness for conflict. When it happened, warfare resulted in death, whereas the games would stop at the first serious injury. Now suppose we took both the war display and the game as efforts on the part of the Kummer to make certain relations known. There are elements of relations 1 and relations 2 in each, but in the anthropologist's contrast, relations 1 between them, can we also detect 2 indigenous modes of knowing? Both kinds of encounters had ritual intent. The assertion of clan solidarity in the spear dance was testing the strength of pre-existing relations, as in the categorical designation of perpetual enmity. Now Ray, and it was rather odd at the time, insisted that sustaining antagonism towards the traditional enemy was a condition of the clan's own increase and future strength, fertility. In this, perhaps, it had something of a divinatory effect. In fact, the performance comes close to Martin Holbrad's notion of infinition, an inventive definition, in Cuban divination, a categorical announcement that provides a newly conceived baseline for future action. With the future in mind, dramatizing readiness for conflict took knowledge of pre-existing relations 1 as a newly enacted premise for the fertility to come. Reenactment was required, or the world would not be renewed. In short, relations with the enemy already exist. It's the clan that has to remake itself. As Holbrad said, the pronouncement and infinition does not make a claim about the world in the sense of representing it, but interferes in its ontological constitution. With infinitions, to know something really is to change it. By contrast with the spear dance, in the Kummer Nettle games, men and women acted out a state of affairs that had no resolution. The game simply ended when the participants stopped. The relations between them were remade in their absolute separation on this occasion. But while the division, relations 1, between the sexes was categorical, what was brought overtly into relation 2, the delineation of the conflict, was unpredictable. It could indeed get quite rough. People could be injured. Setting into motion conflict between the sexes, this relations 2 enactment left open how men and women would appear. I would interpret this as an indeterminacy as to the attributes or qualities of the beings being joined in this confrontation, relation 2. No one knew quite what would happen, quite how people would behave, and thus what they would show of themselves. And I suggest that what was instantiated was less a new premise for action than an experimental probing of what the effects of interchange as such might be on this occasion under these circumstances. Hovering over the men and women in 1955 on that particular ceremonial ground was a question of how they would be provoked to reveal what men and women can sometimes be. If the anthropologist describing these relations had an interest in indigenous knowledge, he or she might offer them as examples. They don't have as their objects phenomena that Euro-Americans ordinarily associate with knowledge. They seem to belong to the politics of social interactions, where, of course, all kinds of properties get attached to people or to ethnic groups. But insofar as the terms are premised on uncertainties that have to be put to the test of relations, they're no less the outcome of scrutiny, experimentation, or intervention. And I conclude very, very briefly. How do we assess one another's knowledge? That a distinction between the world of natural science and the science of the concrete coexists with continuities in the kinds of intellectual operations by which people everywhere know their world has become thoroughly embedded in the anthropological imagination. The appreciation of relations has been no small part of this. Given the extent to which anthropological narrative rests on making relations 1 explicit, perhaps we can find in the language of description an internal divergence that helps elucidate what is demanded of this concept, so ubiquitous in English at least. The distinction, rather clumsily, presented here as between relations 1 and relations 2 captures two kinds of uncertainties in the ethnographic record about the properties of the entities being described. Indigenous knowledge is partly a matter of indigenous knowledge as it circulates in the metropolitan world of activists, ecologists, and agricultural innovators, including areas of interest that are very much part of this symposium. It is also a matter of indigenous knowledge, coterminous with whatever world is inhabited. The way people imagine relations, 1 or 2, between persons are resources for exploring the practices of the making of knowledge to which anthropologists are well equipped to point. However, we might look here for the same kind of heterogeneity that Manuela finds in rights and claims over indigenous knowledge as such. I was drawn to the Kuma case for the ethnographer's delineation of an internal difference. This was a difference between, in my words, the enactment of relations 1 and relations 2. Relations 1 reinvigorate and thus make again pre-existing relations 1 as a premise for action, where uncertainty is all about effectiveness and the possibility of the appropriate properties or terms failing to emerge. In relations 2, the terms are rendered indeterminate, so uncertainty is about the properties themselves, exposing a world where, among other things, it is indeterminacy that is remade. The contrast may, of course, be found at any order of anthropological knowledge. Thank you.